Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Natalie, and I'm an associate in the Adult Services Department at Westlake Porter Public Library. I would like to welcome our guest this evening, Roseann Chic Canfora, who will share her personal experience of the Kent State shootings, as well as the cultural legacy of May 4th. An eyewitness and survivor of the Kent State shootings on May 4th, 1970, Dr. Canfora was one of 24 students indicted by the Ohio grand jury and later exonerated for activism during a weekend of protests against the Vietnam War. As both a professor in the School of Journalism at Kent State University and a member of the May 4th Advisory Committee, Chic continues to educate and inspire the public through her teaching and activism, and connecting the lessons of the anti-war movement to emerging political movements today. Everyone, please welcome Chic Canfora.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, CJ, for assisting, and especially to the Westlake Library. I love these library programs. They're nice and informal. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk with people about my experience, now hard to believe, 50 years ago, when during a peaceful anti-war protest, the Ohio National Guardsmen opened fire into an unarmed crowd of college students. Wounding 9 and killing 4. My brother was one of the 9 wounded students. His roommate was also one of those wounded. We both had friends that died that day. And so we have spent 50 years trying to keep the truth alive in hopes that that kind of tragedy will never happen again in America. And for that reason, I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to talk with you about my experience, to relate it to the 50th commemoration that just took place on May 4th, 2020, and why many of us for 50 years have worked so hard to dispel some of the myths associated with that tragedy, and also to make sure that we learn the right lessons from it. So that kind of use of excessive force, particularly in response to the exercise of our First Amendment rights, will never happen again anywhere in America, let alone a college campus. So I do have a couple of things that I have teed up with Natalie to share at an appropriate moment. I have a very brief video that will walk us through that fateful weekend, but I also have some slides that might help to inform exactly what it looked like 50 years ago. But before I turn to those kind of visual things, I want to let you know that at any point, if I'm talking about something, you have a question about what I just said, or you want clarity around something, feel free to submit a question and don't feel that you're interrupting, because I want this to be authentic for you and an opportunity to truly inform and hopefully inspire you to tell others what happened and join us in our quest for keeping that truth alive. In 1970, I was a very typical American young woman who was on her way to college. Like other young Americans at the time, our high school classmates were either going off to war in Southeast Asia or going off to college. My brother happened to live in the dormitory next to mine at Kent State University, and I arrived on that campus not largely aware of the war in Vietnam, other than that my friends were going off to fight there. I had grown up in a military household. My mother and father both served in World War II. My mother was an Army nurse. I went through her scrapbooks as a little girl, envisioning myself someday being an Army WAC just like her, and was actually disappointed when I arrived on the campus at Kent State that they had a ROTC program for Air Force, and also, I believe, for Navy, but not for Army. And so I might have joined the ROTC program at Kent State if they had an Army ROTC program for women. And other than that, I just went to college like a lot of young people do, just trying to be more of an extension of what I already was in high school. Thought I would go to college and join all the clubs, and I tried out for cheerleader and flasherette and was the social chairman of my dorm. And while I was working very hard to just be pretty much what I had been in high school, there was this very visible and unfamiliar presence on the campus of anti-war protesters. I remember throwing the anti-war leaflets away. I didn't really understand why they were opposed to the war in Vietnam. Having grown up in a household where my parents both went off to war, I always assumed my three brothers would one day go off to war if they were called to serve. I had never heard of anyone staging an anti-war protest. But as history shows, many people like me grew to learn more and more about that war as our friends started coming home wounded or scarred emotionally from that war. We lost a number of friends in the Vietnam War. And when my brothers started to get their draft notices, particularly my older brother, who was a year older than I was and living in the dorm next to mine, when I knew that he was opposed to the war and didn't believe in what America was fighting for there, it bothered me that he would have to go and be put in a kill or be killed position. So much of the anti-war movement initially were a lot of people like me who were just slowly becoming aware of the fact that there were varying opinions for and against that war. There were various beliefs around whether people should go if they don't believe in it. But with the draft, you went or you didn't, depending on the number that was called. But I do remember the time when I stopped throwing the anti-war leaflets away. And that was because there was this very vibrant group of young people on the Kent State campus who were working very, very hard to educate people about the war. And they just seemed so dedicated. I had never seen a group so committed to always being out there. It didn't matter, rain or shine, they were educating, they were marching, they were leafleting. And I think that's, and I say to college students today, that's one of the beauties of a liberal arts education. You find yourself in this wonderful think tank with 20,000 students doing just what you're doing, trying to figure things out, figure out who you are. And it was the first time in my life that I started to hear opinions that were different than mine. I started to meet people who looked and behaved and thought and worshiped differently than I did. And it was a moment of illumination for me as a college freshman to begin to develop my own independent thinking around issues. And I would say that probably one of the most remarkable moments in my freshman year was seeing when the Oakland police came to Kent State to recruit for a very racist police force that was killing a lot of the Black members of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. A group of Students for a Democratic Society, largely white students on campus, and the Black United students band together to take over the building where the recruitment was going on. And not only did they stop the Oakland Police Department from recruiting for their police force that day, but a number of students faced expulsion. And in a demonstration that was jaw-dropping, every Black student, thousands on the Kent State campus, undergraduate and graduate, packed their bags and walked off campus to a university in exile. I can still remember being 18 years old and just watching these people marching for something that they believed in, all leaving the campus at one time and thinking, who thought of this? Like, it was such a powerful moment. I was starting to discover the power of voice, the power that people had to stand up for what they believed in and to do it peacefully and to have an impact, because the university dropped the charges against the protesters and brought our African-American students back on campus. So that I gave you that introduction to give you a sense of my own arc of awareness, my own growth as a beginning college student at a time in America when there was lots of division, lots of disagreement around the war in Vietnam. I didn't think until now that America could ever be that divided on issues confronting our nation. But I've changed my mind since then. And so I want to talk about why it was that I came to join the anti-war protest. It was, number one, learning more about the war, and growing up in a household where I always imagined that America were the good guys. We were the ones propping up democracies all over the world. We were the ones that were fighting against oppressive regimes and so forth. And the more my friends came home from Vietnam and said, I'm not over there fighting for anything I believe in. And when you had things like the Tet Offensive and the My Lai massacre, seeing in our name, America's name, peasants, people who, plow their fields with water buffalo and live in grass huts are dead, elders and women and children, it changed the course of that war, and it dramatically changed public thinking, including mine. So between watching the height of student activism at Kent State in my early years there, but also learning that the power of the student voice and the voice of the anti-war protesters became something very enchanting to me, but also really meaningful for me, because I did not want my brothers to fight in that war. We participated in a lot of different protests in 1969 and 70, whether it was in Washington, D.C. or in Cleveland or whatever. And I'd always seen a lot of different tactics. Some of those tactics were peaceful, sit-ins and so forth. But there were times that the tactics became much more militant. And I saw that those militant tactics take hold when people reached a point of frustration, when they felt strongly that they weren't being heard. 50 years ago, we could get this close to Richard Nixon. I can remember lining the streets coming out of Akron-Canton Airport and holding signs and yelling and seeing him look right at us, knowing that he heard our anti-war chants, knowing that he saw our signs, and the power that I felt, that I not only had a voice, but that I could be heard. Of course, as the war continued and more Americans started to die in that war, we saw some of those tactics turn a little more militant, and that happened at Kent State the weekend of May 4th. On April 30th, after Nixon promised to wind the war down, he announced that he was now expanding the war into Cambodia. There were college campuses erupting all over the country in protest, and Kent State was one of them. And on Thursday night, we became aware of the fact that, and we didn't even have social media back then, there was going to be a national student strike. And I don't know if it started at Rutgers, I had heard that, but our plan at Kent State was on Monday, May 4th, we were going to join with students on campuses all over the country and not go to class and go on strike until we stop that war. That invasion of Cambodia was such a slap in the face to a movement that had been largely effective at that point in turning public opinion against the war. Walter Cronkite, a free press in America, played a significant role in educating us about what was really happening there that was contrary to what we were being told by our government leaders. We didn't have the right to vote then for the people that were sending our friends off to war. And so it was all of those factors together that I think laid the groundwork for what would become the largest anti-war protest in the history of this country that week. And so on Friday, May 1st, students at Ohio State had engaged in a protest. Some of us went down there to support them. Some of those students had been jailed. Some of those students had been shot with a buckshot. So we came back to Kent, and that night there was people in the streets in downtown Kent chanting anti-war slogans, spray painting buildings with slogans like US out of Cambodia. And it was that night that the actions turned more militant. I remembered in Washington, not long before that, when we had one of the largest protests up to that point at the Washington Monument. And instead of paying attention to all of those hundreds of thousands of voices, Richard Nixon publicly announced that he was going to watch a football game that day. And it was at that point that a lot of people, including my group of friends, that just thought it was time to be a little stronger in the way that we communicated to him that enough is enough, particularly now that the war was expanding. I participated in militant action, destruction of property in downtown Kent on Friday night. I'm not proud of that, but I don't regret it. I just have come to terms with my own understanding of what motivated me to move from more peaceful sit-in types of protests to spray painting a building with US out of Cambodia, to throwing a rock through the window of the Army recruitment office. I know that as a 19-year-old college sophomore, I was willing to go to jail for malicious destruction of property. I was willing to pay a price for showing my anger at the escalation of that war. I was not willing to be shot 3 days later by a firing squad for those actions. I say that for a reason, and it's something I want to return to put into context what might happen and what does happen when someone reaches a point of frustration. They do things that are uncharacteristic. And when I talk to college students today, I say, while I understand what motivated me to throw a rock through that window, I remember thinking tomorrow, those people that are trying to recruit more people for this war are going to have to clean up that glass, and they're going to have to know how angry we were at them for what they're doing to bring more young men to their death in Southeast Asia. I knew that someone would have to sandblast that building and take our anti-war slogans off of it, but they would have to think about the destruction of human life in Southeast Asia. Well, we were using the destruction of property to make that statement. What I didn't know 50 years ago was those tactics are well, they might feel good for the moment, they're ineffective. There was nothing, it didn't do anything but actually make us look more like, a bunch of thugs and hooligans downtown breaking windows. Because even though there were a couple of political targets like the Army recruitment office or the AT&T building, because there was a big war profiteer, there were other opportunists in the crowd that started breaking the windows of the small shopkeepers and whatever. And that's what happens in protests with opportunism. So we, for 50 years, have talked about what we did 50 years ago and tried to put into context that, well, those might be militant tactics that we think are effective at the moment. The real power we had as students was coming days later for the National Student Strike, which didn't involve destruction of property, which wouldn't involve any militant action, would involve the numbers of students, not just at Kent State, but students all across the country in one unified voice saying, we're not going to enter your corporations, we're not going to graduate from these universities, we're not going to go to class. No status quo until you bring our friends home, until you stop this war. And so while I'm atoning for actions that I chose 50 years ago, I use those always as teachable moments, because while I truly do believe in using our First Amendment rights to freedom of speech, I also think that there are effective and ineffective ways to use our voices. And Monday, May 4th, in the broad context of that entire weekend, was the most powerful moment we could have that weekend. Saturday night was similar to Friday night. There was an action against the ROTC building. There was a handful of students actually identified in photos who tried to burn the building. It was a little Army barracks. It was scheduled for demolition. It was unoccupied. and the fire was put out. When the Army ROTC building was completely surrounded at the time, about 20 minutes later, it just went up in flames. To this day, we don't know who burned the ROTC building. We don't believe students did burn it, but it did give cause to bring the National Guard to Kent. Sunday night, there was a peaceful sit-in on front campus. Students were sitting in the street and asking the president of the university to come out and talk with us about the now presence of the Ohio National Guard on our campus, and also our plans. Wanted to talk with them about our plans for the National Student Strike on Monday. The National Guard asked us to go onto front campus and said if we moved from the street to the lawn, they would, President White would come out and talk with us. We did as they said, and as soon as we moved onto the lawn, they advanced on us with tear gas. They had fixed bayonets, they had helicopters overhead with searchlights, and we were running from them, and it was our first inclination that this was a very serious reaction to student protest. It was puzzling because there were a lot more students involved on Sunday night than they'd seen in downtown Kent on Friday night, or the few that were at the ROTC building on Saturday night. On Sunday night, students had come back to the campus. A lot of them were home for the weekend. So students on front campus, some of them were coming just to learn what had happened over the weekend. Some were coming just to protest the invasion of Cambodia. Some were coming to protest the invasion of our campus by the Ohio National Guard. But yet that peaceful protest was advanced on by the guardsmen, and that night several students were stabbed in the backs and in the legs by guardsmen's bayonets. On the morning of Monday, May 4th, that is the fateful day when the Ohio National Guard eventually opened fire on us, and it's there that I want to pull up the clip of Fire in the Heartland. I gave you all of that perspective to know that this weekend, and I'll have Natalie start to tee that up. This did not happen in a vacuum. Northeast Ohio was a hotbed of labor activism at the time. Kent State was a hotbed of anti-war activism at the time. There was a very strong Black United Students and Students for a Democratic Society that were fighting for many issues, anti-racist issues. And so that particular weekend that started out with the protest of the invasion of Cambodia, continued with a protest against the ROTC building presence on our campus, the peaceful sit-in on Sunday, and then finally Monday, May 4th. I have a clip that will show you with eyewitness testimony what that weekend was like.
It is not our power, but our will and character that is being tested tonight.
They only have one thing in mind, that is to destroy higher education in Ohio.
On the morning of Monday, May 4th, when I woke in my dorm, I was awaking with the realization that the soldiers that were outside and guarding the doors of my dorm were not there to protect me.
I had a history examination Monday morning. I remember the professor announcing to the students on Monday morning that if any of them felt that the events of the preceding days had interfered with their ability to adequately prepare for this examination, that they would be able to take the examination at a later date. And my girlfriend at the time made me promise that I would not go to the demonstration that day.
The rally was just going to happen. People were going to show up, and what we ought to try and do was give it some more positive, more constructive direction. That you know, we'd had the trashing downtown, we'd had the burning of the ROTC building, we'd had confrontations the previous night where some people had been bayoneted by the guard, and the governor, James Rhodes, he compared us to the fascist brown shirts or Hitler Youth or something like that.
The worst type of people that we harbor in America. We are going to eradicate the problem. We're not going to treat the symptoms.
I had two decent professors. They were just great about it. And they both said at different times of that morning, just make yourself a simple task. See if you can come up with something that says student protest in America. Because it wasn't just Kent.
I kept seeing that noon rally on Monday as the moment when we wouldn't just be students at Kent State. We would be students across the country, all at the same time at noon with a concerted call to end the war in Vietnam.
I've just made a commitment that I wasn't going to go to that. But then I also said to myself, this is too important for me to pass up.
There was a string of guardsmen stretched out from the ROTC building, a formation. And as I got past the last guardsman, he said to me, "Hey boy, what's that you're carrying there?" And I said, "Just a couple of black protest flags." And he said, "Well, today we're going to make you eat those flags."
I was still the vice president of the student body and president of the student senate. I felt that it was my obligation to be out there to make sure that nothing occurred that was going to harm any of those students.
I actually stood up on that brick structure and tried to call for a student strike.
He made a very brief speech. Is it the feeling of the students on the Kent State campus that we should join the national student strike to oppose the invasion of Cambodia?
The guard on campus, Governor Rhodes' rhetoric, and that betrayal Sunday evening, there was an extra edge of anger and frustration.
One of the National Guard Jeeps drove up to the front.
And they started reading an order for everybody to disperse.
There wasn't anything out of control. We had a right to be there, and they could not stop us from speaking.
We were not an unlawful assembly. Get the hell off our campus. Then, of course, it's tear gas time again. Tear gas began to arc over the crowd, into the crowd. By then, we've gotten fairly good at being able to pick up the cool end of the canister because the other end's hot. And toss it back, returning the favor.
The National Guard started marching toward us. They had on helmets, gas masks, and they were carrying M1 rifles with the bayonets attached. And I was among hundreds of students. We ran up over Blanket Hill. The guardsmen came marching across the commons. They followed us up the hill, past the pagoda. We all ran down the other side of the hill into the Prentice Hall parking lot.
We started picking up whatever we could and trying to throw it at the guard. Of course, we were at the bottom of a hill. It was not a really good strategic position.
We didn't have steel helmets and gas masks to protect us. The tear gas exchange stopped, and students started chanting, "They're out of gas."
And then I see this one student with a black flag, once the guard had stopped, sort of slowly work his way, and I'm saying, wow, there's my picture.
And I stood there, I waved my black flag. I knew my life was in danger. But at that time, I thought, if I have to risk my life to make the most powerful statement I can make, I'm going to do it.
I walked up behind my brother and I said, "Alan, they're aiming right at you. This is getting really shaky." And just as I said that, Troop G just started to move away in a V formation and start their ascent up the hill. And I asked him to come back to the parking lot. And Alan said, "Wait, I want to see where they're going."
And as I looked and my sister watched, they started marching up the hill. When they got to the top of the hill,
It hit us. They didn't go anywhere.
about a dozen men stopped, turned, raised their weapons.
I saw a guy pointing a rifle towards me.
The guardsman with the baton in his hand was saying, "Get set, get ready, fire."
This metal sculpture just erupts in this cloud of rust. The tree, nice big chink of bark comes off. The student got hit to my right.
I was just knocked to the ground.
The bullet hit my wrist. I thought, this is like a bad dream.
We could hear bullets zipping past our heads and thumping into the ground. Jimmy Riggs pulled me behind a car riddled with bullets.
Tom Grace, he He's screaming. I looked over. The boot was blown off of his foot.
He's yelling to me, stay down, stay down. And when you're caught in the open, being fired on, with no opportunity to defend yourself, it's the loneliest and sickest experience you can imagine.
When the shooting stopped, this silence fell. I still feel and hear everything from that moment. One moan and one cry and one scream was joined by more and more and more. This collective cry of anguish. No, you did not do this. You did not do this. I could see at the foot of the hill, a boy lying face down.
The body of Jeffrey Miller, laying on the street.
There's probably not a worse image in the minds of all of us.
Like someone tipped over a bucket of blood, and people were just picking themselves up off the ground. But you could see this woman starting to sob and let out with a scream.
Mary Vecchio, who was in that Pulitzer Prize-winning photo with outstretched arms.
She gestured, I shot.
The first of 4 students to be killed was Jeffrey Miller, 20-year-old honors college student from Long Island.
I'd been with Jeff Miller the whole morning. Went back to where I thought he was, and it's still unbelievable. If there's such a thing as a temporal non sequitur, this is it. This shouldn't be here. How do you process pure, naked violence?
As the shock set in that they had done this to us, a worse yet image was looking up at that hill and watching those men while 13 young kids lay bleeding and dying. They walked away. Many of us then just ran around aimlessly, looking for the people that we loved, trying to make sense of it all. I didn't even know I was running past where Allison Krauss was dying in the arms of Barry Levine.
Allison Krauss stood 345 feet from the guardsman when she was hit in the side. She was 19 and in the honors college. Sandy Scheuer from Youngstown was not involved with the protest. She was walking between classes with her speech therapy partner when she was hit in the neck. She was placed in an ambulance with Tom Grace as paramedics attempted to stop the bleeding.
I remember the ambulance attendants trying to revive her, and she had a neck wound, and I remember them saying, it's no use. And I remember them pulling the sheet up over her head. It's probably one of the moments that'll never leave me.
Bill Schroeder, like Sandy, had nothing to do with the protest. He was an Eagle Scout raised in Lorraine, an industrial town on the shores of Lake Erie. Bill was shot in the back from 382 feet away. He died in the hospital an hour later.
By order of President White, the university campus has been closed. Please return to your dormitories and leave the campus by the shortest route as soon as possible.
We went into our rooms and just grabbed a few things and packed a bag kind of hastily. And before we left, I remember my father saying, "Show me where it happened." So as I walked up the hill to the pagoda, I saw bullet shells. And I just reached down and picked up a handful of them. And as I was holding those shells, I just looked down at those triggermen and just started screaming, "Murderers, murderers," as I was holding these shells. And I just had my fist out. I just remember being so angry. I felt my father putting his arms around me and holding me really tight and begging me to stop screaming at them. And my father, this World War II veteran, realized this can happen in America. It just did.
The next day, John Filo's photo made the front page of the New York Times. Across the nation, Kent became a rallying cry as nearly 3 million joined a national student strike against the war.
What is it in the makeup of the American psyche? What is it in our country that we will come to that point where we will shoot down innocent young people on a college campus? I think it changed America, changed the way we do things forever. I would never, ever forget what happened at Kent State.
I'm going to be looking actively at the chat area to see if there's any questions, but this was the 50th anniversary of the May 4th shootings. We had for many years, starting the first year in 1971, come back to tell the truth that we knew. It was during that year that at a time when we thought National Guardsmen would be indicted for murder or manslaughter, that the Ohio grand jury returned a report and 25 indictments against 24 students and a faculty member. The grand jury report was so biased that the U.S. so biased against students that the U.S. Justice Department actually ordered the report to be publicly burned. It was literally put on fire in the back of the Portage County Courthouse by decree. But they let the indictment stand. They made their way through several days of trial before then they were thrown out for lack of evidence to prove that there was any criminal conduct on the part of the students. But what those indictments did was bought another year of silence while we were all put under a gag order. We weren't able to share the truth we knew. We instead just prepared for the trials where we thought those trigger men would be brought to account, to have to explain why during a moment of a peaceful protest when there was no threat to their lives, there was nothing happening that would have warranted a use of force, let alone the excessive force used during that 13 seconds of gunfire. We have then spent 50 years hoping to answer the question why. We have returned every year on the Kent State campus, despite the university's initial attempts to keep us from returning. The 5 years in, the president at the time, Glenn Old, said 5 years was long enough to remember and said there would be no more commemorations. It was then that a student group, the May 4th Task Force, for the next 45 years, held annual commemorations. And as students today, for the last 45 years, they said, we will never forget what happened here or never let anyone forget what happened here. 10 years after May 4th, 1970, the university president, Brage Golding, said 10 years was long enough to wear a hair shirt, as if those of us who returned to try to process what had happened to us there, to try to teach others about the lessons we had learned about that weekend. Despite that, we kept coming back, and despite the university's efforts to silence us year after year or to make us go away, they even changed the name of the university one year from Kent State to Kent, as if that would shirk the image of Kent State as the place where the Kent State shootings happened. There was a failed effort to have a memorial that we pressed for decades. They raised $6 million to build a fashion museum at Kent State, but did not do the same national fundraising campaign or even form a fundraising committee to raise money for the May 4th Memorial. So, and in 1977, they actually built a gymnasium on the site of the shootings, the area that you saw referenced in the film, where the guardsmen actually knelt on their knees and aimed their guns on the practice football field and started their ascent up the hill, now has a big, massive gymnasium built on it. But that kind of denial of Kent State's history started to shift several administrations ago when Dr. Carol Cartwright finally responded to our request to stop people from parking on the spots where the 4 students died. We stand in candlelight vigil on those spots every year, and then the next day you see tire treads in the candle wax. So we, by working very closely with the more recent university administrations, were able to cordon off those spots where the 4 students fell. We were able to get in a May 4th visitor center where you can learn about it, and it's a museum to what happened there. We had the site declared a National Historic Landmark recently, and we have worked very, very hard to have a walking tour this year for the 50th. We had a virtual commemoration, and that is because Kent State University over the course of time did the same kind of soul searching that those of us who survived the shootings have done. You know, what motivated us to do what we did then? We've always held out hope. I've always held out hope that a guardsman, one of those trigger men, has gone through the same kind of reconciliation and atonement and will tell us what made them lift those weapons, what made them look through the scopes of those rifles and then not only start shooting at us, but continue shooting for 13 seconds. I mean, just take out a watch sometime and time that, and you'll see what a horrifically long time that is to be firing into a crowd of 18 and 19-year-old kids. Some of those guardsmen were so intent to fire that they had to be hit with a baton by one of their majors to get them to stop shooting. So we just need to understand why. I spent decades being angry about it. I spent decades wanting vengeance or justice. But 50 years later, I just want the truth. Was it the hateful rhetoric of the time when Richard Nixon called anti-war protesters on college campuses bums? The vice president at the time likened us to Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan. Governor Reagan in California said, if these students in America want a bloodbath, let's get it over with. And then in the film clip, you heard the governor of Ohio, who said we likened us to vigilantes and said we were the worst type of people we harbor in America. He didn't see us as idealistic youth that wanted to bring our friends home from Vietnam. He put targets on our backs when he sent in armed gunmen and told them to see us as an enemy. If it was that hateful rhetoric that made those men open fire on us, we need to know that. And we need to know that so we can understand it, learn from it, and make sure that it never happens again. I'm not able to see the chat, but I do want to see, I'm hoping there are some questions. Are people able to speak in this forum, or is it all with written chat in YouTube?
It's all just chats in YouTube.
Okay.
But
no, I will continue to talk, but I'm sure there's probably some questions.
Oh, yes. Actually, would you mind if I ask one?
Sure, go ahead.
All right. So of course you mentioned both the pain and the anger that you felt regarding the tragic events of May 4th, but you chose to return to Kent State to continue your education, and now you work there as an adjunct professor of journalism. So what inspired your return to the institution?
Well, I love Kent State. I talked to you a little bit about my own metamorphosis of awareness, and I had an opportunity to speak to college freshmen at their convocation this year. And my greatest hope for them was that they would get out of their university experience all that it should be. College campuses, if you look at anything about the history of student activism, have always been a haven for freedom of speech and freedom of thought, a place where young people can do what I hope we all count on young people to do and to be, the conscience of America. You have 4 years on a college campus to give you time to do the thinking and the dreaming, to look at the world and what's happening in it, and to imagine yourself working in it, in what place or what part you will play when you go out there into that world to make, hopefully, a difference in that world. So I'm grateful to Kent State University. Even though I harbored a lot of resentment for decades over university administrations that were so insensitive about May 4th and just treated us like dirt when we came back because they didn't want us reminding them of this indelible mark. I am so grateful to people like Beverly Warren, the president at Kent State, who 2 years ago, when I heard her speak at Chautauqua, not only apologized and talked about the importance of that moment, but really made the strong statement that a college campus is a place where freedom of speech should be encouraged and protected. And it was at that time that we asked the university to take over the commemorations themselves, because we thought under this new moral leadership, we actually had hope that the commemorations could have the funding and the resources and the staffing needed to do it right, but also that it would last in perpetuity. I saw one question there, someone asked if we were going to mark the spots where the wounded students were. Yes, that is something that was discussed by the 50th Commemoration Committee. Those markers have already been designed. And I'm sure that when we're past the social distancing aspect of the university's closure, that we will have a moment like we have with all the milestone achievements we've had in the last couple of decades, that we'll be able to celebrate that we now can mark where those 9 wounded students fell. Let me see. Marilyn says, yeah, it sure was a battlefield. I can remember waking up in my dorm on Monday, May 4th and looking out my door. I was actually a phys ed major when I started at Kent State. So I used to sit on my 4th floor windowsill at Lake Hall and look at the football field where Kent State University's football team used to play. And the morning of Monday, May 4th, that football field had about 150 pup tents, jeeps, tanks. There was no need for a military takeover of that campus. It just set the stage for the tragedy that resulted. And I don't believe Kent State under the current leadership would ever let that kind of armed force come onto a college campus. After campus was shut down and you returned home for summer, did you experience negative reactions from others that you were a student at Kent? Absolutely. The Krauses, Allison Krause's parents, got a big blown up poster of her in the mail that said, "Good riddance." We had hate mail and bomb threats and hang up calls and so forth. My own aunt came bursting into my mother's kitchen while my brother was still bandaged from his wound, saying, "You know there was a sniper, you know there was a sniper. You kids had no business being out there." We were just saying, "Aunt Marion, there was no sniper. What are you talking about? We weren't doing anything that warranted their shooting at us." But it was just so hard for middle America to accept the fact that American soldiers would turn their guns on American people without some good reason to do so, without some provocation. And so just like the Ohio grand jury, a lot of people, including our own relatives and many of our friends, just latched onto, you had to be doing something wrong. Because an American soldier would not just turn his gun on you unless you gave him a good reason to do that. So, another thing I do want to say in response to the question about why would I come back? I mean, I earned 3 degrees there and I teach there presently, not only because I love Kent State University and I credit my college education for a lifetime of activism and for a lot of good work that those of us who Rhodes called the worst type of people we harbor in America, we've gone on with our Kent State education to do great things that Alice and Jeff, Sandy, and Bill didn't have a chance to do. But Kent State University, for all its faults, didn't know what to do with us. You saw in the clip that we had to pack a bag and get off campus in 2 hours. They let the FBI and other investigators into our dorm rooms, and we saw things like my hiking stick, my roommate's prescription medicine, and my friend's pellet gun or squirt gun, all on these big tables in Memorial Gym in the weeks to follow, as if to say, look what we found in the dorm rooms of these college kids, as if we were these weapons-carrying, drug-induced crazy people. Imagine what you'd find in college dormitory rooms right now if you wanted to put whatever you didn't like on a table. stretching across the length of the gym. So the university didn't know really how to react, and we were all going through PTSD. Were it not for some very, very caring professors that helped us finish our classes through the mail, occasionally checking on us by phone and saying, "Are you okay?" We didn't have that support. The university didn't do anything to reacclimate us to the campus the way we see happen in Parkland, where I had the privilege of spending 2 weeks after their shootings. I remember being so touched watching the therapy dogs come in as the kids come back to their campus to find the spot where they drop their book bags. The flowers, the candlelight vigils, and all the community support. Kent State didn't have any of that. We were never invited back. We were never offered counseling. We were kind of left on our own, as you saw, to deal with our PTSD. So, some people, I never understood why all of us who witnessed that didn't come back every year. That's what I needed to do. That was my personal way of coping. And it turned, into a life of activism for me. Don, you returned to somewhere, did you? Yeah, the negative. Speaking your truth is so important. You must be honest to build a good society. Was James Rhodes ever held accountable for ordering? No, he never was. In fact, I protested the naming of the Rhodes Tower down in Akron University after him. It pains me that he never was held accountable for that hateful rhetoric. And, he was running for the Senate at the time. And he was down in the polls, so he used it as a law and order opportunity. I just remember hearing those words the night before the tragedy and just not realizing the danger that he was putting us in with them. Not when there was a trial at one point where there were 8 guardsmen that were indicted by a federal grand jury. And it was also very biased, like the court proceeding was as biased as the Ohio grand jury report. Governor Rhodes was called Your Excellency when he came in to protest, and then those indictments ended up being thrown out for lack of evidence that they had violated our constitutional rights. No, there was just a lot of whitewashing going on of the truth, and that's why I still hold out hope that one of those guardsmen, and there are fewer of them every year, just like there are fewer of us who survived the shootings. I'm really still very hopeful that one of them will come forward and tell us, was there an order to fire? We need to know that. Were they just told to make a, we've seen in COINTELPRO documents, and we saw in the Nixon tapes, Bob Woodward had brought to Kent State some of the recordings. He referenced a recording when he spoke at Kent State 2 years ago, where Nixon just said, he referenced Kent State as, if you just make an example of a few of them. Like, if we need to know, was there an order to just make an example of Kent State? Because if that was the intent, if you shoot down a few, maybe it'll send a strong message to the many across the country. If that was it, it backfired because it gave way. The film said 3 million, but there's reports that there were 5 million students that were participating in the largest student strike in the history of this country as a result of Kent State. So if that was the intent, it backfired. When I listened to the videos at the Kent State Memorial, I thought I heard the leader of the National Guard threaten a second shooting. Is that true? Oh yeah, he did. In fact, Glenn Frank, the professor, Glenn Frank, who was my geology professor, he has been credited with saving lives, because after the shooting and the guardsmen went back down to the commons, a lot of students then started protesting the shooting and were standing where we started the anti-war rally just not even an hour before. And the guardsmen actually told the faculty marshals, Glenn Frank and another faculty marshal, get them out of here. We're going to move on them again. And there's a recording of Dr. Frank saying, I don't want to be part of this. You guys just get out of here. He was begging the students to leave. And he goes, there will only be a slaughter if you don't leave. He said, if you don't ever listen to another person in your life, listen to me now. You have to leave. And for all these decades, many people credit Dr. Frank with saving lives. but they said they were going to move on us again. I'm a Kent State grad. I was on campus from 75 to 79. I'm now a middle school history teacher and did a remote lesson with my students. Great. I'll Zoom with your students this year if you want. I'd love to. I mean, we have talked with so many, especially middle school. There's a lot of middle school history students that participate in this national history competition every year. And my brother and I, and many of us who are May 4th activists and survivors and eyewitnesses have spent decades, not just in programs like this, but also helping young students learn the right lessons from this and also process history. Because my son's own the eighth grade history book actually had a caption that you saw in that film of the triggerman during the shooting. And the caption under the photo said, during the Vietnam War, many people protested across the country. Here at Kent State, a student protest got out of hand. Students started pitching rocks at the National Guard. The National Guardsmen, fearing for their lives, opened fire, killing 4 and wounding 9. And then it said at the end of that caption, can you think of other times people have protested? What happened to them? I was just mortified when I saw that and went to my son's, history teacher and called the school board to try to have that history book taken out. But it just, was a reminder to me and continues to remind me that as long as we have breath to share the truth that we know, it is our hope that the truth will make its way to the history books. And again, I hope that truth is shared by the triggermen themselves who will tell us. Now, and it's not that they haven't spoken. They had people like Colonel Fassinger, Captain Martin on the speaker circuit to say, when the Discovery Channel or the History Channel did a documentary, they would come on and give their side. And it was always the same thing. Our guardsmen were frightened. They were coming off the Teamsters strike. They were exhausted. It was confusing. It was hard to see. We were surrounded. And most of their self-defense claims, or all of their self-defense claims, I should say, have been disproven. The Scranton Commission, appointed by Nixon himself, said the shootings were unnecessary, unwarranted, and inexcusable. That's a direct quote. The FBI report, their direct quote is, the guardsmen's claims of self-defense were quote unquote fabricated subsequent to the event. But yet here were these few guardsmen in the early years going out, probably more of a PR campaign to say, look, sorry it happened. No, they never said sorry. To say, yeah, it happened, but here's why. It was a tragic situation. Our guys were scared and they just reacted. And I think that there's others that have a different take that can lend their voice to this. And I'm hoping one of them is watching and will join me in a program like that, like this one, to talk about that. How could we send money to support honoring the students in honor of free speech? The May 4th, 50th commemoration, actually, it turned out to be a virtual commemoration. That was kind of disappointing to us, but I think more people tuned in because it was open to people around the world. And we were disappointed because the concerts that included Joe Walsh and David Crosby were supposed to raise money for 4 scholarships that would go to 4 students who were enrolled in the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. And so that would be a great place to honor the 4 students who were slain, to give scholarships to students in their name who are focusing their studies on peace and conflict resolution. Why did the guardsmen have live ammo? Good question. Did we ever find out who made that decision? No, I would defer to my brother, who's like a walking historian, archivist and whatever, whether or not somebody actually accepted responsibility for dispensing the artillery. I don't know who did that, but whoever to me, it's more the inflammatory rhetoric behind the decision to send those bullets flying through the air into the bodies of unarmed college kids that was the real catalyst for that. Let me see. We were a town divided. Ruth says the rhetoric of Rhodes only inflame the situation. It's a lesson to recall for leaders today. I absolutely agree. The inflammatory rhetoric we're hearing out of our government leaders today on Twitter, but just out loud, is very frightening. And we're seeing it manifest itself in protests during a pandemic where not only, and I'm grateful to Governor DeWine. I didn't vote for the guy, but I wrote to him and thanked him for his very thoughtful and reasoned and science-based decisions to keep Ohioans safe. And when I saw the protesters in Michigan going after Governor Whitmer for the same thoughtful decisions, it didn't bother me that they were protesting. I advocate protest for things that you believe in. It bothered me that they were brandishing swastikas and Confederate flags, and worse than that, assault weapons, as if to say, this is how we make our point in America. It's a dangerous trend, and dangerous if we become tolerant to that kind of behavior in the marketplace, where we go out to take a stand. I fear for those counter protesters who support the governor, who are wearing masks and saying thank you. Of course, they're quarantined and staying home or whatever and staying safe. But when it's safe for both sides on an issue to be in the streets, are we so tolerant now of people being able to take assault rifles into those moments, knowing 50 years ago what happened when you let one side come out with guns while the other side were only armed with their voices? It's a very scary situation in America today if we don't learn the right lessons from Kent State. Yeah, I'll Zoom your class. I'm so, I had an opportunity to hear a group of high school students who are considered activists. Some of them were serving on their local school boards. Some of them were really active in environmental issues and whatever. And it was in Baltimore when I was at a conference. And I remember one of them said to me, and it really was puzzling to me. She said, well, you guys had it made in the 60s. You guys had a big thing to rally around, that you could really motivate all of you to come out in numbers. And it was the war. And she didn't even mention that we didn't have the right to vote. But I just said, off the top of my head, I can think of so many huge things that your generation could be rallying around. At the top of that list, to me, is student loan debt. They're shocked when I tell them that my tuition at Kent State in 1968 was $197 a quarter. My room and board was $450 a year in what I think is the best dorm on campus. I could work did work a minimum wage job at Cyberling Tire and Rubber in an office there the summer before I went to Kent State, and made enough to pay for my college education that year. And that's why I had time to be a student. I had time to pay attention to what I was seeing and hearing on the campus. I not only had time to learn and to think for myself, but to act on my conscience. Students today, and I do believe it was by design, not by accident, are so strapped with tuition debt and credit card debt that they have to work 2-3 jobs at the same time they're going to school. I teach an online media power and culture class at Kent. And sometimes they're on with me at 1 in the morning because they've just gotten off their job serving tables. When did we lose sight of what a college education should be for students? I do believe that just like media conglomeration and the loss of the fairness doctrine during the Reagan years, and now look what's happening to media and talk radio, that I think it really was, we learned a lot during the 60s about if you know too much, you might actually act on it and oppose government policy. And there's a real dumbing down of America intentionally. And that's why we have to have programs like this. That's why we have libraries. That's why we have good history teachers and thoughtful people who on a Wednesday night aren't watching a program like The Bachelor, but you're tuning into your library and you're learning about your history because it matters. And I just applaud everybody who tuned in tonight. And I'll take some tough questions. I'm always assuming somebody's going to come on and go, you crazies all deserve to be shot, because we've heard that. It was very difficult. I faced one crowd who was very angry that Jane Fonda was one of the featured speakers the weekend of May 4th. I was more disappointed when the university closed and we weren't going to hear Lawrence Tribe be our keynote speaker on Monday, May 4th. The greatest constitutional law professor in our country would have had a lot to say on Monday, May 4th about a moment when our constitutional rights were put to their greatest test 50 years ago, and what's happening to the unraveling of our Constitution today. That was a real loss when we had to cancel his visit. Do you know any resources available to help alumni process with the unique trauma from this experience? My dad was a freshman, still struggles with it to this day. Well, I know that Kent State University just recently had a couple of programs and forums on PTSD, and they teach some classes. One of our professors in the School of Communications actually teaches a course just on PTSD and the trauma that comes with surviving tragedy. And when I mentioned that I had a chance to go to Parkland, I actually work for Cleveland's public school system as their head of communications, and do a lot of crisis communications training and supports, and was called to Parkland to assist in their public information office for the 2 weeks after the shootings. They didn't know I was a shooting survivor. They only knew me as this crisis communications specialist. But it was very healing for me to just kind of look at a community that already had seen this before, whether it was Columbine or Sandy Hook or whatever. Now it was Parkland's turn. They were all learning from past experience what they need to do. It was inspiring for me to see kids like David and Emma going off to their state legislature and fighting for gun control. I remembered that's what helped me, was just, it just renewed my cause, my anti-war activism and so forth. And so, you know, I came back to Kent State talking with the university president there about just how important that was, how healing that was for me to hear her at Chautauqua just tell us that they acknowledge our pain was healing for me. So I don't know of any specific resource I can give you, but I know that if you want to email me at chickcanfora@gmail.com, I'll hook you up with Professor Smith, who can talk with you about the resources that she shares in her class, which is excellent. Well, where are the tough questions here? And I don't know, this goes, are we only 2 minutes away from the close of this?
Yes, we're about 5 minutes away.
Oh, okay. You can still go on the Kent State University website and click on the May 4th 50th commemoration. The program is beautiful and very meaningful. You'll see the clip that you just saw here, but much more footage and clips, but you'll also hear the voices of today's students. They inspire me. I love talking with Kent State students today. When I mentioned the students in Baltimore, I have similar conversations with students today that say, we don't have anything to rally around. When I say, imagine if we had social media back then, we could organize 500,000 people to go to Woodstock or Washington for a protest with snail mail and long distance phone calls. Students today have social media. I asked those students in Baltimore, and I asked Kent State students today, why is tuition debt and student loan tuition debt and the wage and wealth disparity, climate, what's happening to the climate? They're going to breathe this air and drink this water and live on this planet a lot longer than the rest of us. How are those not the issues that they are fighting, rallying around? Just imagine if students today did what we did, and what was, I think, the most effective of those weekends of protests was that Monday of all. I mean, nobody was shot in downtown Kent when they were breaking windows on Friday. No one was shot on Saturday when the ROTC building went down. 2 days later, students were shot during the most peaceful protest of that weekend. So we need to understand why. We definitely need to. We have another one. With the rise of Trump, the alt-right and white nationalists, you worry that another May 4th. That's why I'm doing this. I'm more worried now than I have been in the last 50 years. I worry so much. And when I talk to students today, even as I say to them, just imagine if you all banded together like we did on Monday, May 4th, and said, we're not going to classes until you forgive our student loan debt. You bail out the banks, you bail out the corporations. When are you going to bail out students so that we actually have a future? I said, do you know how fast they'd probably scramble? But to me, the greatest thing I can tell them, and I'll say it to anybody who's really worried about the state of our country right now, we still, at least for now, have the right to vote. And we fought very hard 50 years for the right of these students to vote. And I encourage them all the time, vote as a block. Pick the 5 issues: student loan debt, healthcare, climate, whatever, they're issues, and say, we will, as a block, vote for the candidates that respond to us. Watch how fast these congressmen will pay attention to a voice that is never heard. It wasn't heard 50 years ago. It's not going to be heard today if we don't learn the right lessons from Kent State, but also act on what Beverly Warren challenged university presidents to do all over the country: promote freedom of speech. We have to help our students find time to do that thinking and dreaming, but also protect their right to do that. So yeah, I'm very, very worried about the hateful rhetoric coming out of the White House right now. It keeps me up nights. It does. No more questions? I'm chickcanfora@gmail.com. I answer emails. If you have more questions, feel free to write to me. I'm on Facebook, except it's just a column now. I don't ever post happy pictures of my family or my work at home right now or anything. I just comment on the state of affairs because it troubles me so much. But I hope you're all staying safe. And I think our Ohio governor is doing some really good things right now. I'm grateful that we had that good 6-week break to turn things around a little bit. So I hope you're all heeding that good advice, and will continue to do so. And I want to thank Natalie for the opportunity to speak with all of you, and CJ for enabling this whole thing to happen. And all of you who tuned in, thank you so much for giving me a chance to share this information with you. And I hope you'll go to the Kent State website, check out the commemoration video. It's very, very powerful. And David Crosby does perform on it. He didn't let that moment go by without giving us that treat that he wasn't able to deliver in person, but he did deliver it in the video.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Dr. Canfora, for an engaging and enlightening presentation. We're grateful that you were able to take the time and effort to come and share your thoughts and experiences about the events of May 4th, as well as your dedication to preserving that history. Again, thank you for speaking tonight. And a special thank you to all the viewers for joining us and asking questions. Stay safe and have a good evening, everyone.
Bye, everybody.